And we're live. Here we go.
Awesome. Welcome back, everyone, to Representacon. If you're just tuning in, this was kind of our virtual convention for this weekend. A lot of things were going on, as you're probably aware. So this seemed like a really, really good opportunity just to get people together, maybe people that couldn't physically be together, because this is the state we're in right now, and actually just uses an opportunity to really celebrate and talk about themes and other topics that are really, really important to us. I'll be moderating today. For the next little hour, we have a panel and some wonderful panelists. And we're going to be talking about facilitating games with Asian themes. So I'm really excited for this one. Before we dive into it, I think it's really important that we do some introductions. So my name's Steve. I'll be moderating. You can find me. You can see all of our Twitter handles on the screen and what have you. I'm DM Steve on Twitter. I'm also one of the crew members of Asians Represent, and I play on their actual play, Dungeons into Asians. But that's enough about me. This panel is all about our very talented panelists and all the beautiful thoughts that are in their head. So I'm going to go around, I guess, clockwise on the screen. So Clio, if you wouldn't mind, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Clio, as you just said. I'm a game designer. I mostly work in tabletop RPGs, and also I design LARPs. And I write interactive fiction as well. And I'm really happy to be here with all of you. Y'all are great.
Amazing. Moving clockwise. Sorry, it's weird because I'm so used to digital clocks now that clockwise and counterclockwise I have to like cognitively think about now. That's a weird state to be in. I'm so sorry. But moving on, Anthony, if you wouldn't mind just kind of introducing yourself and some cool things about you.
Sure. I'm Anthony. I'm PanoiXP on Twitter and on Itch. So I'm a UX designer, but I do like doing games on the side. Claim to fame is I was actually on James D'Amato's For the Queen episodes. So from that, I kind of made a hack of it, which ended up me here.
I can't wait to hear more about
I think
that.
you're really understating how awesome you are.
Oh, yeah. First, let me lead with how. No.
Actually, this panel is all about how awesome Anthony is.
Surprise.
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 But moving on, just to get some introductions out of the way so we can dive right into the meat of this. Daniel, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Jeremy Lin.
Cool.
No. I'm Daniel. I am one of the co-hosts of the Asians Represent podcast. I am the GM of Dungeons into Asians, and I'm just excited to be a panelist. I'm excited for Steve to lead this panel. I'm just so stoked for everyone to be here.
Awesome. And Daniel, actually, you're going to be in chat too, kind of moderating, is also kind of giving us some feedback because it's going to be hard for me to jump between different screens here. I can focus on maybe one and a half things max.
That's what I'm doing.
Great. Thank you. Last but not least, Banana Chan, could you please introduce yourself in a couple of words?
Yes. Hi, I'm Banana Chan, she, her, they, them. I am the owner of a small box game publishing company called Game in a Curry. And I also design games on the side as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Actually, you did remind me. We should do pronouns really, really quickly. If we can just go around the same loop here. My pronouns are he, him. If we can just focus on the same loop that we just did.
Yep. I use they, them, and she. I thought it was me for a second. They, them, and she, her pronouns.
Thank you.
I use he, him pronouns.
I use he, him pronouns.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Let's go ahead and dive into it. So today's panel is about facilitating games with Asian themes. Before we get into a lot of it, I want to take kind of like hit the pause button on this topic and just talk about Asian themes in general. When we say Asian themes, what do we even mean? Open question. Anyone have any thoughts?
And then we're all just like, oh my God, loaded question.
Oh my God, what?
Yeah, it's a big question. Feel free to like chop that up into anything that's like bite-sized enough. But I want to hear your thoughts. When you hear Asian themes, what do you think about?
I think there are two major things that come to mind for me immediately upon hearing Asian themes in a game, and that's one, it's set in an Asian location, and it's exploring that location enough that you can say like, okay, this is an Asian game. Like it's not only just like randomly set in Korea. It explores what Korea is like, either historically or in a modern setting, or the characters or many of the characters are Asian, and it's also not just like they're Asian, but we never really go into exploring that. It's they're Asian, and we see what that means for them in this world and how they interact with their own culture and other cultures. But it's kind of one of those two things usually.
Cool.
Yeah, I think going off of that, going off of what Cleo said, also like a lot of the time people think about Asian cultures a lot when they're trying to, you know, put that into their games. I think, sometimes when designers are designing games, they're thinking more about, how to handle culture versus, the people themselves. But that's my take on it.
Anthony?
Yeah, I have a hard time kind of answering this one because I think the easy grab is everyone just goes to the Asian media of what they've seen and not necessarily what like an actual Asian theme is. A lot of the times, like especially when I'm designing or at least when I'm exploring this topic, is a lot of what like yeah, even the answer of like what is an Asian theme, like, and going back into like identity and exploring that and kind of digging into those kind of things through play.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to like all of those amazing answers is just, the Asian experiences. In the last panel, I kind of talked about, the experiences of being like an Asian American and how you kind of, especially in the current political climate, don't quite fit in America or even in your homeland. That's how at least I feel about being Chinese Canadian.
Awesome. Those some really, really good thoughts. I wrote down some like key words that really kind of resonated with me. Things like people, places, experiences, culture, identity, exploration. I think that all kind of, it's a big, big topic, and definitely good to kind of lay down a base of kind of what we're talking about here. But let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about some good, happy, fun times. Let's talk about when you're running a game or you're part of a game, you're part of that kind of game experience. What are some of your favorite parts about incorporating Asian themes?
I think for me, not to always jump in first,
Please.
but
We're so organized. We're always going to go in.
We're just going to go in the same circle. Is it clockwise or counterclockwise?
I think it's different from all of us, right? Like we don't have the same order of people on our screen.
No, on the Twitch. On
Twitch. Oh,
yeah.
I don't. I'm looking at Zoom, but for me, so I'm multiracial. And on my dad's side of the family, it's kind of like a medley of European ethnicities, like just a lot of like random European stuff thrown in there. And there is no shortage of games that kind of explore that Tolkien-esque fantasy landscape, like the kind of medieval inspired dragons and mythology that is really rooted in different parts of Europe. And I love some of those games. Like I do deeply love some of those games, but growing up, I never had the chance to play in a game that had any kind of Asian setting or theme, just because like the materials for that weren't widely available. It's only really been in my adult life that I've encountered games that respectfully approach Asian themes, let's say. There's certainly been decades worth of material out there, much of which does not exactly respectfully approach Asian cultures. And so for me, I still kind of have that rush of excitement, that thrill of like, oh my God, I can see myself. I can see this, like this part of myself reflected in this story, in this game that I'm like or the story I'm co-telling with other people in a way that I never got as a kid. So it's kind of like a childhood giddiness almost.
That's awesome. Yeah, like
Yeah.
for me, I know I never really fit into a lot of Asian groups like growing up. And it was hard for me to jump into a lot of Asian themes because I was doing it through very like Western lens. So kind of how I go into it, especially as like a child of like Filipino immigrants, is trying to evoke the experiences and explore those questions in a way that is kind of based to not just like a human experience, but also like an immigrant experience. So I've known a lot of the themes that I've tried to kind of explore have resonated with a bunch of different types of people, or not resonated in a really messed up way. But yeah, it's kind of tricky because I always feel like when I want to run like what I think or what is kind of more accepted or what more obviously is an Asian theme game, I feel like even myself, I fall into very like common media tropes and like movie tropes and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think for me, when running games that incorporate Asian settings or themes, I mean, like a big one is being able to articulate our own experiences within a structure that they make sense in. You know, like Clio, you mentioned, you know, D&D and that Tolkien-esque fantasy. I mean, for me, DMing, you know, Dungeons and Asians has been so cathartic because, you know, I've just been able to really take my culture and share it with my friends. Like I'm able to, like, you know, Agatha is Taiwanese, Steve is Vietnamese, Amar is South Asian, and you know, I've been able to share what I know about my own culture with them and see how their own cultures interface with mine and these like deeply rooted histories. But also I think one of my favorite things about, you know, running games that incorporate Asian themes, not settings, is that I get to talk about Asian food. That is huge for me. So huge for me, just because like it's an excuse for me to talk about like the things that I love. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for me, so a game that Senfun Lim and I are working on right now is called Jiangxi Blend the Banquet Hall. And players are taking on the roles of family members running a Chinese restaurant in the 1920s. And I think something that I really enjoy watching when I see other people play the game is that they can sort of relate to the family members, and they're sort of feeling like, oh, like, you know, this is definitely you know, something that my family would do. It resonates a lot with like immigrants, like everyone has mentioned, like, you know, having to see people are going through that immigrant experience at the table is really important to me.
Awesome. That's so cool to hear. The word of the day, if everyone's tuning in, is resonance. If you're playing along, we're all going to talk about how things resonate. But no, I think that's a really good word, just kind of encompass all of that. It's kind of like other people might call it like being seen or things like that. And I think that really, really kind of hits home. FYI, some people in chat are already talking about how like you're hitting some feels here.
Hitting some feels.
Because these are definitely things I think other people, other human beings out there in the world either have experienced, want to experience, or they're kind of struggling to see how they facilitate it. So again, I think this panel is really, really important.
Yeah, I really want us, I think it'd be cool to address Play Harderer's question. How do we draw from our own real life experiences without reinforcement that they are Asian themes?
Yeah, let's dive into that.
I can kind of start off because I have a humble brag to go with it. So I was playtesting my game for my family, which is a hack of Alex Roberts for the Queen. And Alex Roberts is my favorite designer. She's incredible, and she loves tying mechanics to emotional themes. And that's something that I find easier to role play in, but as well as like I find that easy to teach role playing as well as get into the type of games that I want to play. So my game for my family is about the children of immigrants and they're dying. So the idea is you're going through a series of questions through this kind of gathering to determine whether or not you're going to continue their legacy after they pass. And do you feel that pressure to continue that tradition, or do you feel that pressure where they immigrated and you want to continue that individual success? So the humble brag is, I didn't know this at the time, but Peter Atkinson and his wife Dee Dee were in my game at Big Bad Con. He just introduced himself as Pete. When I found out later, I'm like, you're not Peter. How dare you? Because they and both of them, apparently the game resonated with them for like a couple nights after, where they were really thinking about their friends who were coming from like Eastern Europe and how these same questions were impacting them in a lot of ways. A lot of the same questions are being asked, a lot of the same feelings being evoked, thinking about like gender roles, thinking about familial expectations, thinking about weighing the collectivism versus individualism of that third culture that we kind of experience while being here.
Wow, that's
dang
deep. Dang, yeah.
And I've linked for my family into the chat right now, and it's 100% off right now on itch, and it's a super cool game.
Cool. I cannot wait to check that out.
Yeah.
I played my first For the Queen game just like very, very recently, and I'm like, man, I've been missing out. This is good stuff. And this description, this conversation is just like lit a fire under my butt, and I super want to check this out.
We should play For My Family, but have it set around La Ning's family in Dungeons and Asians. And we'll just all cry.
Yeah, Yeah, it's just cry. That'd be great. I could use a good cry. But let's go back to the question here. So this was Play Harder, and we were talking about how do we draw from our own real life experiences without reinforcing negative stereotypes when we're talking about Asian themes.
Yeah.
I think setting expectations is really important, right? So setting expectations beforehand, telling players, like, we're going to encounter these themes. This is how we can approach them respectfully. Telling players, treat them like they're, they're people, not like, just characters that we're going to stereotype.
Yeah. I think for me it's, anytime I'm playing a character in a game, I for the most part am using Asian themes, my own experiences in that character, whether or not I hard code them as Asian. I think that's something really important to put out there.
Cool. So maybe I think we'll take this idea, let's kind of run with it, and let's talk about maybe some obstacles that you might face when incorporating Asian themes. We kind of like have been skirting around it, but let's talk about things that could go wrong, and let's talk about how we address those things.
Okay. Who wants to start? Banana, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's okay. I was actually gonna talk about how sometimes in the games that I've played, people love doing accents, which is something that it's hard to talk to the person who enjoys doing that, like telling them like maybe try not doing that. There are other things like when people start using stereotypes, that sort of thing is like always a hard conversation to have, right? I don't know the answer immediately of like what you should do in case this happens, but something that I really liked about Clio's game, Bus to Busan, like the boy band game, like from a while ago. Like what I really liked about that was that there are lose conditions. I don't know if Clio wants to talk more about that.
I will talk about the kimchi roll. So the game is The Long Drive Back from Busan, and it was a Golden Cobra winner some years ago. My memory is bad, but essentially it's everyone is playing members of a boy band, and they're on a drive basically to go perform at a festival, and it's kind of like their career is suffering and they're trying to like get their shit together in order to have like a good performance. But in LARP, in freeform LARP at least, generally there aren't really like lose or win conditions. It's like you're playing to tell a story together. You're collaboratively playing to try to like make an interesting story happen. But I had a rule that if anybody mentions kimchi like at all, then that person automatically loses the game. And that's like, and some people were like, I don't get it, why? But other people, like any Asian player who's like read the rules, is like, oh yeah, no, that's good. Because so often there'll be like one thing, one aspect, one element that people associate with like Asian culture. And for Korea, it's like the two things that come to mind are K-pop and kimchi. The game is about K-pop, so obviously that's going to come up, and it's good for that to come up. But people often mention kimchi because it's like the one thing they know. And it came to a point when I was feeling a little bit too much like, in other people's eyes, my cultural identity was completely just tied to just like fermented cabbage. And so I wanted to try to set the tone by kind of just having that as an example of, we're not going to try to flaunt knowledge of of Korean culture in a way that's weird, or like showy of like, look how much I know. And also because that's not necessarily super friendly to players who aren't as familiar with the culture, right? You're trying to set like kind of an even playing ground for everybody. But that's kind of the backstory of that one rule.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because we kind of talked about two different obstacles here, one obstacle and how to address it two different ways, almost from like the design game perspective of, if you say this one thing, the game is telling you just don't do it, right? And then we have this other side where you're in the middle of a game, maybe like you've already started up, someone does something, and it's like you have to have a conversation about that. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, do it. Get in here.
kind of to that, I actually find it easier to what Banana said about setting expectations because I've had experiences where things come up middle of the game and it's so much harder to have that conversation afterwards. So, and kind of what Cleo was saying in the beginning, like people are very familiar with Western themes. So I was writing a fantasy game for a group of my friends, and I was slowly incorporating some at least like different cultures. So I actually had a like refugee camp of goblins like migrating into the capital city because all the outside lands are being like beset by demons. So the paladin, the lawful good paladin, decided to slaughter them all. And like it split the table and it was like the most immersed that people got, but it was also I was also like shocked. And I know it's about having the conversation, but it's so difficult because he's one of my good friends. He helped me move on his birthday, but like that's the kind of conversation where that's how he sees it. It's very difficult to kind of see past that thing of, and he doesn't necessarily see what he's done as wrong still. And really what I've done is just kind of avoided playing because I don't know how to handle it. So there are a lot of stuff that comes up. So I hear, especially from podcasts and blogs, like have that conversation, but no one really knows how to have that conversation unless you're actually going more into like educating white people and like people of non-Asian descent or like whatever you're experiencing. So I find it a lot easier to kind of set that expectation up front. It's like, hey, let's talk about this. Like, and the hard part was we did have lines and veils. We did have the X card. I think all of us were just so shocked that we didn't use them. And we just kind of kept going, just like autopilot.
Yeah, something that I've seen some people do.
Sorry, man. I'm gonna jump in here. It sounds like we're having some technical difficulties. Daniel, is that correct?
Yeah. We're gonna take like a 2-minute break. We'll be right back. So just stick with us. Stay in that chat. I'm gonna pull us out, and then we'll be good. Okay, we should be back. Here we go.
Awesome. Cool. Daniel, thanks for sorting out that technical stuff. I think we're good. We can kind of dive right back into this conversation. So as a really, really quick recap, we're talking about, maybe you're in the middle of a game, something happens and you need to have a conversation. And we're talking about how that conversation in the middle of the action is quite difficult to have. I actually want to dig a little bit more into that because I think that's really relevant for maybe a lot of our viewers out there. Maybe what are some ideas or things to keep in mind if you need to have that conversation once you've hit an obstacle when someone's trying to talk about a theme?
Oh my God.
I know we've already talked a little bit with safety tools too as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, just like, I would just go straight into safety tools and be like, these are things that need to be established like before your game even starts. Like one of the things I love about your K-pop game, Clio, is that you put all of this information right there for the players and the GM. You'd be like, hey, okay, no kimchi, can't do this, no accents. Like there are all these things that you've put in place to minimize the amount of harm that can be done by, like an innocent gamer or, somebody who's trying to be racist. But I think like setting all of this up well before it even starts is super important. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of workshops as well, like at the beginning of, well, especially LARPs, but also tabletop games where you are doing some of, like Banana talked about expectation setting. And you just kind of lay out like, look, this is what's cool here. This is what's like absolutely not cool. But I feel like it's also really important to note, and like I really want other GMs to, because I've run into this several times where sometimes you're running a game and you do everything, no one's perfect, but you do everything relatively perfectly at the beginning. You set those expectations, you set out the safety tools for people to use, but that's not going to prevent people who are kind of intent on just ruining people's time, or not even like they think like, oh, this is so funny, this is silly, like I'm just going to like, this is my way of having fun and I'm going to prioritize that. And safety tools, like they're there so that you can, like, if there's somebody who is going kind of off the rails and that kind of really negative way, there are some really, like the cut tool, for instance, like sometimes you just have to stop the game altogether. And sometimes, like, and I want to like have people feel like they have permission to do this. If a game is going really badly, if you have a racist or several racist players at your table, you like feel free to just end that game. Like, you don't owe it to them, and also the other players are probably uncomfortable too at that moment. Like, and you owe it to yourself to just end an experience that is going badly. Like, you don't have to keep going.
Yeah, I think that I've seen some GMs do some really cool things where they incentivize their players into using these tools as well. Like I remember, I think it was like James Stewart or someone, but he mentioned that, you know, if you use the X card or if you use, you know, any of these safety tools, I will buy you a beer afterwards, or I will buy you a coffee afterwards. Like, you know, incentivizing players to actually, you know, feel like that they can use these tools. These are accessible things and they're not, you know, there to scare anyone off. That's one thing that I saw that was really cool. And another thing that I've seen done in another game called Baphomet, this was like a LARP, like a 2 or 3 day long LARP, where they set the expectation that like players should create the experience that they want. And if someone, you know, taps you on the shoulder and is like, hey, maybe not this, like I'm out, then don't think of it as like a bad thing. They're trusting you and telling you that this is too much for me. So trying to have conversations and framing it a different way sometimes helps.
Yeah, Anthony, Dan, you want to weigh in a little bit?
Yeah, I have an example. It actually took place at Breakout Con on this exact panel. I think Banana, you were on that panel.
Yes, I remember this.
Yeah. This is to also answer one of the questions that was, you know, that was in the chat, and it's we were doing a panel. It was facilitating Asian themes in games, and then a white guy in the audience basically asked a question along the lines of, why do Asian themes matter? It was a silly question, and the entire room got real heated, including all of us. We were like, it was literally like a hold me back sort of moment. And this is like a perfect example of how things can escalate within a game or within a panel. I basically was like, hey, you know what? We're running out of time. Let's pause right now. Let's parking lot this. I really like to use the parking lot technique where I'm just like, hey, I'm just going to put that to the side right now. I'm going to make sure everyone's okay. And then I actually stood with that guy in the hallway for like 20 to 30 minutes, and we just talked. And afterwards, he actually was like, oh, that's interesting. And went around and actually looked for Asian games that were at Breakout Con that I told him about and tried to learn more. But I basically separated that individual from the rest of the group, the rest of the panel and the workshop in that case. And we just had like an honest, candid conversation about like, hey, look, this is why what you did was wrong. I'm not mad at you, but here's what you could do better next time. And here's what you could do to move forward to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Because I think one of the things that it's always good to consider is positive intent. Like, yes, there are going to be people who want to play a game a certain way. And generally they think that, oh, this is the way I think it's fun. I want to make this fun for everybody. But their idea of fun just might be outright racist or just might be harmful. And so it's telling people like, hey, your fun isn't everyone else's fun. And this is a shared experience. And I think it's like being like straight up with somebody is super important. Anthony, did you want to add?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think all of you have really good like managing and conversational techniques. I'm actually in the opposite camp of I mean, I kind of broached the question because I don't really have those tools. And I'm in the kind of school of thought of if you don't set those expectations, if you can't have even a civil and open conversation about race and identity without the fiction, then it's incredibly difficult to have it within the fiction. So for me, if I can't have those conversations like in real life as friends or as acquaintances, then I'd actually rather not play that game with that person. I'd try to actually find another group because I've been playing tabletop RPGs and starting to do LARPs for about like 7, 8 years now. God, 2020. Um, and I've jumped through so many different groups because there'd always be one or two like highly problematic people. And I found kind of the piece of, and gave myself permission to feel like it's okay to have no game rather than to play in a bad one, because you're not the only one suffering in it. A lot of other people are just kind of enduring because they feel like, oh, this is my only group that I have. This is my only friends that I can turn to share this hobby. I mean, first off, Asians represent community, like one shot community. All these other people to jump online for sure, because there are other people like you, other people like us. But honestly, I like to, with all of these conversations, I also want to emphasize like boundaries, because sometimes, especially as a game master or as a player, like we're already dealing with a lot in the real world. Sometimes you don't want to have to deal with that at the table as well.
Wow. You mentioned something that really kind of like stuck with me, and was, if you can't talk about racism or talk about a theme outside of the fiction, you probably shouldn't be talking about it within your own fiction. And I think that's a really, really powerful and really meaningful statement. So thank you for that. I wanted to, from the conversation we're already having, I got the feel that we're talking a lot about, or our viewers might perceive it, that we're talking a lot about like con games where you're maybe working with people who are maybe strangers. But I know from my own experience, a lot of people come to me and say, hey, I'm looking for some guidance, some advice, when it's not a stranger, it's a close friend or maybe an acquaintance. And they feel that, some of these tools we've talked about maybe not fit the situation. Does anyone want to comment on maybe how you can take these things we've talked about and apply them when the relationship is a lot more intimate?
I honestly think it makes it easier if this is like a close group of friends, or say it was our Dungeons and Asians group, Steve, and one of us said something that wasn't appropriate and we didn't realize it. I think if you have like a close relationship with the people that you're gaming with, it often makes it easier to have those conversations, have those respectful conversations. Like if you imagine having a group that's been gaming together for 2 years, you can fall into this sense of security where like I've known this person for 2 years. I've known their fictional characters for 2 years. I know their play style. I know what they like, and you have this sense of comfort. So if you encounter these sort of obstacles that we've been talking about in your very close, intimate games, I personally feel like it would be easier to talk to a person like that. I actually have an example of that. I've been playing an online first-person shooter with the same group of guys for over a year. We've gotten to know each other pretty well, and then out of the blue, I found out that one of them had posted something that wasn't necessarily racist, but was really insensitive on Reddit. And he basically posted a link on the Marvel subreddit, and it was a comment when they announced that Shang-Chi's cast and crew was like 98% Asian. And he basically posted a comment and said, why does this even matter? Why are people excited about this? And at first I was super angry. And so what I did was I actually stepped back from the group for like 2 weeks. And I was talking with another Asian person who was in the group. And we decided that between us, whoever was closest to him would have a conversation with him. And we did that. And he actually apologized. And, now we're all back to gaming together again. But I think it's just like having those tough conversations with your friends. I mean, if you, I think that's my answer at least.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Oh, sorry, what were you saying?
No, I was just gonna be like, yeah, powerful stuff, and I'm glad you shared that story. Sorry, Banana, please dive in.
Oh, yeah, I absolutely agree that it's easier to talk to closer friends just because the boundary setting is so much easier. And, like Anthony was saying, if you have, if you're playing with someone that you don't really know too well, then it's okay to step away from that table because you're probably never going to see them again, right? And if you do see them again, then you have those self-care options where you're just like, okay, I'm not going to talk to you again. I'm not going to play with you again. I know what I'm doing. But when it does come to like, a close friend or someone who is a friend, trying to establish like, what is okay for me and what isn't, it's still a tricky conversation. It's still hard, but like you were saying, Daniel, it's a lot easier to just set these boundaries, set expectations, tell them like, maybe not do this again next time.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. I think these are all really good thoughts, and I love hearing these kind of stories. I'm actually on the other end where I find it very difficult to talk to friends when they do something or something happens in a game, and I feel like we need to talk about it. Sharing this, I actually in the past have had that conversation with a friend. It went really poorly, and we no longer talk to each other.
I'm sorry.
So like thank you. That's an extreme case, and there was like a lot of learnings from it. If I could go back in time, obviously I would do it differently. But I think everything we've talked about here, kind of like the ideas, the strategies you laid out, if I had those way back when, I think things would have gone much more differently.
I think I want to add something. I think it's also important that if you're on the receiving end of this, you not necessarily take it personally, but take it as a means of feed forward. Okay, a way to get better. Like a clear example of this, and this is even just like a small mess up too. We've been playing Dungeons and Agents for a while now. And I feel so comfortable with, Steve, Agatha, and Amar that I'm like, let's get into it. And almost every session, without fail, Steve's like, let's go over lines and veils. I think there was one session when I remembered it before Steve reminded me. And I'm like, yep. And it's just become a thing now. Steve reminds me, and it works out that way. And I take no offense to that. I'm just so excited about our game that sometimes I forget about it, and Steve reminds me. And that doesn't change my relationship with Steve. That doesn't change how I feel about Steve in a negative way. In fact, that makes me respect Steve even more. So if you're on the receiving end of this, I think it's important to know that this is all feed forward. This is how you improve. This is how you get better.
I think it's also important to note that if you are getting like a piece of feedback, and if somebody is pulling aside to be like, hey, what you said or did was kind of hurtful or problematic, that is like a very strong show of good faith, and that like that person wants to continue having a friendship with you, because it's not easy to do it. It's really hard, and it's terrifying a lot of the time to pull someone inside and be like, look, you did something that's harmful, and I want to explain why it was so, and like what we can do in the future to make sure this doesn't happen again. And so I think just acknowledging that somebody taking the time and energy and emotional resources to do that is like, that means they care about you and they have faith in you, because I will not do that just for anyone. If like for a stranger, sometimes depending on how much like mental and emotional resources I have, I won't always do that, or I won't care as much about what the result of it is, because at the end of the day you have to just like take a breath and live your own life. But it's a pretty strong show of how strong a friendship can be to have that bravery to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, and also kind of tack onto that, since it's so much emotional labor that we end up doing, we have to remember like it even though it shouldn't fall on us to kind of educate people, it often does. But the point is like we also shouldn't have to do it alone. So with Daniel and Steve, they're doing it together. The like Asians Represent crew are on the same page. I think having that responsibility spread out too, because like I know I make mistakes and I want to be called out for it because I don't want to certainly get into a habit for it. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means it happens sometimes. We've just kind of been exposed to all of these things and we just kind of internalize a lot of it. So like a really good quote I heard from an author named Ibram Kendi, who wrote the book How to Be an Anti-Racist and Stamped from the Beginning. He like in a talk he said like if you've never had the tools like for an umbrella, you can never claim you've never been wet. So I think that's great. That's a good out for all of us. Like we all make mistakes, but like we all want to be dry. So it's good to kind of help each other and build that community too, because these are really hard conversations, and we all, if we care about each other enough, like hopefully you do in that group, and if not, like be like me and switch groups. But have that expectation and have that relationship set up so you can help each other be better, and you can have that expectation where you see it as a gift and not just as like an assault on your own personal character.
I love this conversation. I'm getting so much like positive warmth from this, because I feel like a lot of times people are like, oh, something terrible happens at a table, leave. But we're not saying that. We're saying that actually you can change your perspective on this. You don't have to immediately leave, unless of course, that is for your own safety, but we can have a conversation about it. We can use it as a stepping off point and as a learning tool and experience to really kind of, feed forward, like Daniel was saying. That's awesome. I kind of want to take this conversation and splinter off to a different direction here. We have been talking a lot about safety tools and things like that. And I want to dig more into when you're facilitating a game, what other things can you do, safety tools or maybe beyond safety tools, where you can encourage kind of like a considerate way to incorporate these Asian themes into your games?
So you mean aside from safety tools, or which ones in particular we like?
I think I want to hear your thoughts on kind of what tools you use prior to the game. Safety tools is one of them, and if you want to dig into your favorites and why you use them, that's great. And if you can think of any other ways you can encourage others to incorporate themes and use them in a very virtuous, I don't like that word, way. I don't like that word. Forget I said that.
Ethical way.
Thesaurus virtuous.
I could talk about workshops a little bit more, because I love workshops.
Yeah.
So in my LARP, The Truth About Eternity, which is about like the future of ancestor worship and ancestors that are kind of being digitized and kept in digital tombs, I submitted it. It was part of Festival, which is like a Danish LARP or gaming festival. And so like I knew going into it, this is primarily for a white audience. So, and obviously when you're writing a game, like if you write a game for an Asian, like, and you're like, oh, this is mainly for an Asian audience, like that's going to be a very different game often, or the workshops and like how you prepare players is going to be very different than if that's not the case. And I wanted to give people something to do instead of like just telling them what they couldn't do. So there were a few things where I'm like, okay, so let's not bow, for instance, because oftentimes like people who aren't really familiar with the nuances of bowing and what that means and all the different little things that go into it, like it can come off very much as like a parody or like you're mocking someone. And so instead of that, I provided a workshop on like kind of something that you can do just like with like your glance and where you're looking and how you're behaving in the space that isn't bowing but kind of serves a similar purpose. And similarly, like in Long Drive Back from Busan, I didn't want people like running around like throwing out random Korean words to like make the game feel more Korean. So I was like, what's like a relatively safe thing you can do that like it happens in K-pop all the time is like if you want to pose for a picture, you just do like this little symbol, a little heart. Because that's relatively safe in the scheme of things. Like it's not, there's so many worse like things you could do. So I think it's important to lay out things you can do and participate in, as well as the things that you should steer away from.
Anthony, Daniel, Banana, anything you want to add of kind of like either how you workshop or kind of set those expectations before a game?
Banana or Anthony, I have one, but do you two want to say anything?
I think always having a session 0 is really important, just to, get everything laid out for you so that you know what you're getting yourself into. I don't know, Anthony, if you have any tips on session 0s or something similar.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little about lines and veils, and for those watching who or listening don't know what lines and veils are, you're establishing topics about what like you don't want to cross the line for, or what you want to have in your game but goes behind a veil. So if you want to have like an intimate scene, you don't have to go into detail. It goes, okay, it happens, and where lines like you just can't. So with session 0, something I kind of stolen from Microscope is the palette, where you talk about stuff you want to have in the game as well. So it's not always just about restriction and constraints. It's also about, oh, I want to include this theme or include this group or this type of object. And then at least that gives us some space to kind of unpack it. And kind of to what you're saying earlier, Banana, about like incentivizing using safety tools, like I think trying to get across, and I certainly need a lot of work on this too, of like having people feel that they have permission to use them. I know, like, I try to keep the open door policy of just like, you can get up at any time, don't explain yourself, like, don't feel like you're betraying the group if you just get up and have to leave. Like, even if you have to use the bathroom. Like, I know people just like hold it like we're children. It's like, no, we're adults. Go use the bathroom. Like, so it's really about, I think with a lot of people who play these kinds of games, it's hard to feel empowered to do so. So it's really just in that session zero, just, and once again, setting expectations. And throughout the campaign is always remembering and reinforcing that permission. And kind of like what Steve was saying, like, or Steve does with Dungeons into Asians, like, he's the one reminding everyone. It's nice to know that's like not just the game master or the facilitator, because in a kind of a sense, just like how the game master is a player, like all the players are still part of the fiction. So it's also part of responsibility for everyone else's comfort and fun.
And I touch on one more thing before I forget.
Yeah.
So debrief tools are also very important.
Yep.
So I think if you're doing like a longer campaign, doing something like, Roses, Thorns, and Buds, that way when you're doing like another game afterwards, you sort of know what to expect to have, like, to go into, the next game or the game after that. So like a quick run through of what Roses, Thorns, and Buds are. Roses are things that you've really enjoyed in this game. Thorns are something that you want to see less of, and buds are, this is interesting. Let's explore this more.
I'll go into that real quick. Sorry.
Yeah.
Actually, I, once again, selfish plug for my family, I actually included debrief questions because the first time I was playing it with one of my friends and with my partner, I triggered myself. Like, I wrote the questions, like I knew what was coming up. But in the fiction happened, I was like, oh, holy shit. So like, sorry, I don't know if we can curse.
Yeah, you can curse.
Cool. So at the end, I was like, okay, let me like come up with some questions to like unpack this, because if me, the designer and author who knew what was coming up, doesn't happen to, like, would probably be especially helpful for anyone else. So yeah, like 100% debriefs, like those are huge.
Yeah, I think another one, like we've touched on pretty much everything. Like we do the lines and veils at the beginning of our Dungeons into Asians. We do stars and wishes, or a variation of debriefing tools at the end. But I think a big one is if you're doing a long-term campaign in like D&D or any TTRPG, and you're the primary source of all the sort of Asian content, and you want to make sure that people interact with that, faithfully and positively. Big one is make that information available to everyone. I think for us, for Dungeons into Asians, we keep like a digital notebook of all of the content, all the NPCs, their names, what they do, and ideas of cultures and all of our lines and veils, so that if people want to refresh themselves on things without falling onto stereotypes accidentally, they can do so. I think that's the only thing I would add.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. These are all really, really cool thoughts. One thing that I got reminded was that in my online Roll20 game, I'm playing with a lot of new players. I introduced safety tools and all these kind of things. It really helped them engage with the game, which is great. But Roll20 has great features where I have a handout that's lines and veils, and every session I click show players, and it forces them to look at the actual page, and we look at it and we talk about it that way. Likewise, for debriefs, we have the Roses, Thorns, and Wishes. It's its own handout. I document everything. It's all in like one shared place. It's in the game space itself, which is really, really nice. And I find that just really helps the players be responsible and also very considerate with each other. And the conversations have gotten much, much richer. And I have to say that these particular friends, as we've kind of gone through these shared experiences, we've become a lot closer, and those relationships have gotten a lot stronger. So these are all great, great conversations. We have 5 minutes left. I'm going to be selfish and ask a question. Clio, you mentioned workshops. How is that different than a session zero?
So usually when I think of a workshop, generally, like for at the beginning of a LARP often, but I have also integrated them into the beginning of a tabletop thing. And it is pretty much very similar to a session zero, but the difference for me is that you're putting something you're practicing using a thing. So either using a mechanic or using a tool. It's kind of like, this is something that's heavily featured in the game. let's practice using it now so that we're confident in using it later.
Gotcha. Can you maybe I don't do too many LARPs. I find them to be very emotionally draining for me. I love them, but I can do like, you get 2 out of me per year and that's it. Uh, can you maybe kind of give an example of something you would practice in a workshop?
Yeah, so for the Truth About Eternity, which was the Digital Tomb LARP, one of the workshops was kind of teaching people how descendants and ancestors would interact in this world. And so it's kind of like, oh, here's a scene that doesn't actually take place in the game itself, so don't worry about like, oh, it's canon to the game, like we can't mess up. Like it's just you practicing the things, and it's the people who are playing descendants go and visit the tomb, and they have guidelines about like, okay, make sure that you do this, this, and this, and make sure you don't do this thing. And they're just like basically playing out like a very short scene where they're trying to use those tools that are provided and like get comfortable using them and see how it feels, basically.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think that translates to tabletop RPGs as well. Obviously, you're not like moving around. The LARP experience is a little bit different, but talking about this is how the Asian coded people talk, basically alluding to we're not doing accents, which kind of brings us full circle to what we were talking about at the very beginning. I could see that really translating really, really well. Unfortunately, we are out of time.
This is a good segue, though, to our next panel.
Absolutely, yeah. So for those tuning in, we're going to take a short break after this. We're going to take a 30-minute break. We'll start again 30 minutes at the half hour, talking on another panel, which I'm also moderating, called Stepping on Toes. And it's all about what you can do after you've done some unintentional harm and what that looks like. So that'll be really, really great. But for today's panel, I want to thank our panelists, of course. With the time that's left over, I would love for you just to list off who you are again, maybe any projects you might be working on, and just where people can find you if maybe they want to extend the conversation on Twitter or wherever people are happy with it. Looks like some people in chat are already talking about ways that we can continue the conversation. So Clio, I'll start with you. If you give us a quick outro.
Yeah, I'm Clio Yensu Davis. You can find me on Twitter at CYS Davis, and that's where I also am on Patreon and pretty much everywhere all over the internet.
Amazing. Anthony.
Yeah, so Anthony Nomo. You can find me at Pinoy XP. That's PNOY. So there's no I. That catches a lot of Filipinos off guard for sure. But yeah, you'll see me lurking on Twitter and just supporting people on itch. But I do want to give a shout out to Mahar. He helped me with my art for the game, and we kind of collaborated on something. And yeah, if you can, throw in some commissions.
That's at Maharhar on Twitter.
Thank you.
I got you.
Good. That's really good. Daniel, do you want to give us a quick outro?
Yeah, you could follow Asians Represent. We got the podcast, we got the actual play, Represent-A-Con. I'm just super thankful that everybody was able to tune in and enjoy the content that we were going to present at Breakout Con. This is an idea that Banana and I had at a dumpling restaurant after a con last year, and we were just like talking about just like joke cons, and then it just all of a sudden became a thing. So I'm just grateful for everyone who tuned in and will watch the videos and listen to the audio afterwards. But you can find me at Daniel H. Kwan on pretty much everything. My Patreon is Daniel H. Kwan. I have a show called Anything But D&D, and I talk about anything but D&D.
Awesome. And Banana.
Hey, I'm Banana Chan, and I am also very happy that this whole thing happened. Daniel and I came up with some very dumb names for this con initially, but now I'm very happy that we came up with Representative Con. So you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook at Banana Chan Games, or you can go find my company, which is Game in a Curry, through Twitter at Game in a Curry.
Amazing. I've been your moderator, Steve. You can see my Twitter handle down below. We're running out of time here. So I want to thank everyone